Okay, we'll just do one. Well, we're going to try to begin on time. We have some folks coming from Gotham who may be in custody of Amtrak, but we'll begin. This is I hope will be a very informative program about a topic that has really been on everyone's mind for a long time, which is what exactly is the role of institutional shareholder services in increasingly active and indeed almost constant proxy voting system, and how influential are they? How do they work? What is their role? Should we know more about them? Are there regulatory reforms that ought to be considered, or is everything just right? We obviously won't answer all those questions, but we have a group that is extremely well situated to have us think about it perhaps in a less cartoonish way than some of the debates about it. And we're going to kick off with a person who's extremely well positioned to address this, who's Christopher Young, who's now a managing director and head of Takeover defense practice at Credit Suisse, or Swiss to an American. Yeah. But before then, Chris, for several years, was in a really critical role at ISS, where he was the director of mergers and acquisition and proxy fight research, and was in a key role to really participate in ISS's decision-making process around its recommendations regarding very high-stakes M&A transactions. And Chris is going to start us off tonight by talking about his understanding of how ISS works and what its role does, its relationship to its clients, and what it seeks to achieve. From there, we're going to turn to Glenn BOORAEM, who is a principal of Vanguard Group. That's a rather small, local institutional investor firm out of Valley Forge. And Glenn is the head of the corporate governance program at Vanguard and plays a key role in its approach to dealing with proxy voting. And as one of the most respected institutional investment funds, Vanguard is a key player. They manage many Americans, probably most of us in the room, have money invested with Vanguard. And what Glenn's going to talk about is how Vanguard approaches proxy voting itself, how it deals with the differences between its funds in approaching issues, but also give his perspective as someone who has to look at how the election process is going to go down in a high-stakes thing, of what role he perceives ISS has, both in terms of Vanguard's own analysis, and perhaps as important is what he influences what he perceives as its influence over other investors. Then we're going to go to two heavyweight proxy fight champions, Alan Miller of Innisfree and Dan BURCH of MacKenzie. If you're in an M&A fight, these are the guys you want smashing a stool over your adversary's head or doing more elegant forms of persuasion. But they really are the two go-to guys in high-stakes, particularly M&A proxy fights. Whenever the best lawyers I know want to do this, their first calls are Alan or Dan. And so these guys fight all the time, but in the nicest way. And they're also extremely savvy people. They're the chairman of their firms. And they're just excellent, sophisticated people who know probably about as much about getting votes as anyone out there. And they're going to talk to you about their perception of how influential ISS is. Then, because we're in the academy, we're going to turn to the Harry Golkin Professor of Law at this institution and now one of our co-heads of our Institute for Law and Economics, Jill Fish, who has written many, many important articles in corporate law, but very pertinently, tonight's thing has written 2 outstanding recent papers that really try to take an objective look at the role that ISS plays, how influential it is, and why it's really cool to be ISS. And so we're going to kind of go in that kind of order, and then we're going to, the idea is for the second half of the program, we kind of set the stage about the what, get people's perspective, to really put on the table in an interactive way some of the policy issues. We'd encourage you throughout to raise your hands, just to raise them just for circulation purposes. Now, actually, to contribute, if you've got questions of somebody, if you have something you'd like to say, the more interactive we can make the session, the better. And I'm going to kick it over to Chris. I'm going to ask the speakers to use this device in front of them. It's a great kind of old room, but has a very high ceiling, and it's much easier for folks to hear if
Leo,
you
let
use
me
the
just
device.
make a class statement. As you may know, this is part of a seminar that Leo Strine and I teach together. So this is an expanded class, and I want to remind those from the class that their papers are due the last day of class. And for those who have not already gotten comments on their papers where they've submitted a first draft from me, they ought to see me by the end of the week. Okay, back to you, Leo.
So turn it over to Chris.
Thanks, Leo. I think, my job right now is to spend a few minutes trying to demystify ISS as someone who spent 7 proxy seasons there, over 6 years from the inside. First, I want to cover, what is ISS, for those of you who don't know who ISS is, how influential I think they are or are not, and sort of how they come up with their vote recommendations, which is a mystery to some people. So again, I'm going to try to demystify the whole process. For those of you who don't know who ISS is, they are the world's largest proxy advisory firm. What does that mean? It means that they provide soup to nuts proxy voting outsourcing to approximately 1,800 institutional investors. They have the #1 market share. They're down to 1 competitor now, Glass Lewis, and so they dominate this market. What does that mean in practice? It means that the clients of ISS, say like a Fidelity, will download their holdings to ISS. ISS will then match those holdings against proxy statements, definitive proxy statements that are coming out of the SEC for upcoming annual and special meetings. And basically a research team at ISS will take the proxy statement and go through each ballot item and apply a policy to each ballot item. That policy can be an off-the-shelf policy, a sort of generic policy, or it can be a custom policy developed by the particular institution involved. Approximately a few weeks prior to the vote, ISS will put together a report and analysis of each ballot item and then put out a recommendation on how ISS thinks the particular shareholder should vote and send it along to that shareholder. The shareholder, for the most part, then gets to, and I'll get into in a second how different shareholders use that report differently, but they have a period of time to review that report, digest it, and then they, in many cases, come back and actually tell ISS how they want their shares voted. And that could be in alignment with how ISS is recommended, or it could be different. And ISS often will then actually physically vote those shares for the client, and then after the whole process is over, provide reports to the institutional investors on how they voted, and that's normally for compliance purposes. So they do that for lots of meetings. They basically, because of the number of clients they have to put out a report on every single annual meeting, every single special meeting, almost without exception in the US and increasingly in other parts of the world. And people always ask how influential ISS is. I think, again, to reiterate, the ISS delivers a recommendation backed by an analysis. Based on my understanding, the clients of ISS take various approaches to using that research. I know Glenn is going to to give us an inside baseball perspective on that at Vanguard. Based upon my discussions when I was there with various types of investors, I sort of break it down into sort of 4 ways that investors use ISS research and recommendations. Some, admittedly, I think pretty much defer to ISS. These would be the quant funds, some of the smaller smaller index funds that really don't have the resources to put together teams like Glenn's at Vanguard. I think that's a minority of ISS clients. Who?
Half.
Half? Well, we'll get a different perspective from Alan. Some tell me that although the portfolio manager ultimately has the final say, they've created internal processes that in effect make ISS very influential. How do they do that? I mean, the process would be a portfolio manager wants to disagree with an ISS recommendation. They have to jump through a lot of procedural hoops internally. They might have to write memos. They might have to go in front of a committee. A lot of PMs obviously would not, portfolio managers would not want to spend their time doing that, so they end up de facto deferring to ISS. And then some actually, I was just talking to one major institutional investor who told me they always pass along the ISS recommendation to the portfolio manager, and they actually don't set up a lot of hoops for the portfolio manager to jump through. They just say, hey, shoot me an email back if you disagree with this recommendation. And you would think that's pretty easy to do, but I've been told, in most of the cases, the portfolio manager won't respond, even with a simple email to override. So in those cases, again, the ISS recommendation generally will control. And then I think some, particularly like Vanguard, and Glenn will get into this in detail, use the recommendation really as a single factor in a mosaic of factors. And there, of course, ISS, in theory, is the least influential. So that's, again, how I break that down. I think, to me, the key point is no matter how you look at the client base, it's always in the client's discretion whether to override or not. So, without getting to the punchline of this panel at the beginning, my view is that if there are steps to take, people think ISS is too influential. I think the way you tackle that problem is to get institutional investors to spend more time thinking about how they want to vote, and so that they do override the ISSs of the world. Because right now ISS is really just providing a service, getting paid for it, and in many cases that's all the institutional investor wants. Again, there's no requirement that they follow the ISS recommendation. So Leo asked me to also cover briefly how ISS comes up with its vote recommendation. The team generally looks at, they definitely only look at publicly available information. So Alan and Dan can tell you if there's a particular piece of information that...
Chris, what's the background of the people on the team?
Okay, that's a good question. That varies, all right? So I think many of them are fairly young. Some, it's their first job. The business model of ISS, again, what ISS gets paid to provide this research, it's not terribly lucrative, I think, as a recent Latham and Watkins memo put out. When I got there, I was specifically hired. I was previously on Wall Street as a banker, and I was a lawyer at S&C. I was hired specifically to try to upgrade, at least from the M&A and proxy fight perspective, the analysis, and this came on the heels of HP Compact, where ISS got a lot of scrutiny about their recommendation. And I insisted really as part of coming aboard that I could hire people with a particular skill set. So on my team, they had MBAs, CFAs, there was a former MacKenzie analyst, but I'd say that's, Alan and Dan probably can speak to this, that's the exception to the rule.
It's a thing of the past.
And now maybe a thing of the past. So that's the team. But as far as compensation and run-of-the-mill provisions, I think a lot of that is handled by relatively newbie sort of analysts. How does ISS, again, come up with its vote rec? Unlike Glass Lewis, its main competitor, particularly on contested situations, ISS will actually engage in a dialogue with companies, with shareholder proponents. So my team, again, that really focused on contested M&A and proxy fights, always met with either side. That's how I know Dan and Alan so well. They would come down to visit us in Rockville, Maryland on many occasions. I don't know how you can do this job without talking to the participants, but Glass Lewis does that, and I think, in my own opinion, it's a business model decision because it takes a lot of bandwidth to have these meetings and discussions. And it also touches on one of the issues I think we might get to on you know, case by case versus check the box and how that affects the model as well. I can you know, so there are check the box policies at ISS. So their comp model, sometimes widely derided compensation model, is very much of an algorithm where you plug in numbers and the answer is spit out. Corporate America certainly doesn't like that because it doesn't give a lot of room for discretion. So there are those sorts of policies. In my corner of the world, M&A and proxy fights, certainly not check the box. It's impossible really to have a check the box policy, so I can't really speak to check the box. Ours was very much case by case and took a lot of time to come up with recommendations there. And Leo and I were talking about this before the panel. It's, you know, it was always a challenge from my perspective to put out a recommendation to all shareholders. I mean, who are the shareholders, right? So some shareholders are people that have owned shares for 15 minutes, the ARBs and the event-driven funds. Others are perpetual holders, pension funds, index funds, and then a lot of actively managed funds. If you look at, you know, even some of, you know, the Fidelities of the world, they don't own shares that long. You know, a year or two is a long holding period for them. And all of them are clients of ISS, and you're putting out one recommendation. So after I arrived at ISS, I came up with what I thought was the best solution I could at the time, which was try to average sort of a holding period out of all the shareholders that we had to address, and you know, I came up with sort of a 2-year holding period as sort of down the middle. And so the recommendations, at least when I was there on the M&A and proxy fight side, were directed towards an actively managed or an active shareholder that's not going to hold perpetually, but also not directed towards an ARB that is, you know, again, has owned it for 15 minutes. We'll see how that continues. I don't know how that developed going forward, but that's how I looked at the world.
Thanks.
Glenn?
Thanks.
And Glenn has a fix for those of you who are, you know, need your methadone maintenance of PowerPoints. So Glenn was the one who stepped up to the plate to, if you were getting jittery by now, to make sure you got some of it.
Happy to oblige. So just by way of orientation, just to give you a sense for who Vanguard is as an investor, though we're largely known as an index fund shop, we currently have about $1.6 trillion in assets under management. Just about $1 trillion of that is in equity funds, both global and U.S. or international and U.S. About 60% of that $1 trillion is in index funds, but the other 40% is in a variety of actively managed funds. So though index is typically the first thing that comes to mind, and we'll talk about the differences between index and active. From a voting standpoint, we really cover both bases within the walls of Vanguard. The other important thing to note is that that 40% in active management is managed by 25 or 30 other firms. So we have long-standing relationships with many investment management firms like Wellington Management, Alliance Bernstein, and a series of others who manage those funds. So in addition to our own index fund management perspectives, we get investment perspectives, and I'll talk about how those weigh in from a variety of different investors that cover different mandates for us. So in terms of the way we use the recommendations, or we use the proxy advisory services, really the advisory services represent in their business models more than just recommendations. They've got a few distinct functions that they serve both broadly and specifically for us. The first is data gathering. So irrespective of the recommendation side of the business, ISS and Glass Lewis and others in the business either now or before them gather a significant amount of data to inform their recommendations. The primary purpose of that that data for us, where we don't follow the recommendations, is to feed our analytical process. And this is really driven by two things. One, volume and seasonality. So across Vanguard, we hold 4,000, we own shares in 4,000 U.S. companies and an increasing number, about 7,000 today, non-U.S. companies. If we just take the 30 stocks in the Dow Jones Industrials, their most recent proxy statements average over 80 pages apiece. So take that across the 11,000 portfolio companies, and you can imagine a mountain of paper. The ISS report, as an example, averages 15, 16, 17 pages. So we're able to access the information in a reasonably consistent format, reasonably reliably, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But it enables us to manage what, as you can see up here, is very seasonal volume. We're actually right on the cusp of entering into the annual proxy season. Each of these clusters of spikes here represent generally the April, May, June time frame of each year. And both in the U.S. and internationally to a large degree, about 80% or 85% of our annual voting volume is compressed into these 3 months. So the combination of literally 100-page proxies combined with this extraordinary concentration of volume really drives the need for us to access the data in a way that our analysts can digest it, know that the composition of the board is on the back of page 1 instead of on page 17 of this proxy statement and page 27 of the next. So it's a tremendous convenience for us. However, I couldn't come to the law school without throwing in some Latin. So caveat emptor is really the watchword for us as we digest all this information. As Chris mentioned, ISS has its limitations, and they don't always get stuff right. So our analysts do a lot of work to validate the data that we get from them. Fortunately, companies, each of our portfolio companies really has only one ISS report to pay attention to, their own. So they do a really good job of highlighting either outright errors or, in many cases, differences in interpretation of the data. So they serve as, in some cases, an effective check. But the ISS data isn't necessarily stuff we can take right off the shelf and use. So we do have to do some supplemental analysis on our own. The thing that ISS gets the most coverage for is their voting recommendations. For us, as Chris mentioned, it's just another data point, and its importance varies based on the type of issue. We've used the ISS data long enough that we understand where our differences of opinion are on certain types of issues. So there are certain recommendations that we just ignore outright because we have a fundamental disagreement from a guideline standpoint. There are others where we review their rationale, and that may serve as a starting point for a discussion with the company. And because in most cases we've got just a yes and a no vote, there's a 50-50 chance we're going to agree. And one of the challenges in my role and that of my team is explaining that simply because we arrive at the same vote as ISS recommended, it doesn't necessarily mean we got there because ISS recommended it. And a lot of the work we're doing, an increasing amount of, is engaging directly with boards and management of our portfolio companies. That's a tremendous misconception we've got to battle. Just because we voted for or against something doesn't necessarily mean we followed ISS. We just landed in the same place.
Glenn, and will you generally vote the same way on a question regardless of the company, or will you vote differently depending upon how well you thought the company was managed?
It really varies based on the question. There are certain governance...
Give me an example where you would vote differently.
Certainly, and I'll talk through a couple of examples on economic matters, transactions, contests. We'll certainly look at those case by case. Certain governance features, things like rights to call special meetings and act by written consent, are what we consider options to achieve an end in the case of special meetings and written consent to allow shareholders to act independent of the board. So those are a couple different options we might consider depending on what else is in place from a governance standpoint at a company. We may vote for or against something like that, where at the other end of the spectrum, things like classified boards are generally things we oppose pretty consistently. So it really runs the gamut. Rights plans is another one that, again, what is an area where we've, I think, evolved our thinking. We used to be consistently against. We're now thinking more in terms of flexibly designed rights plans that provide some means for shareholders to step in. So that's actually one where we've evolved our thinking over time.
Again, just on that thing, one thing that was in the last few years, I'd be interested in along the same lines of my class, things like so-called say on pay.
Yep.
Is that something where you took a company by company look at it and said if you've been unhappy with a firm, you were more likely to be supportive, but in something where it was performing well, you don't need the tumult? Or
with say on pay, and I'll address say on pay specifically and then step back to a more general answer. For say on pay, we were consistently against the notion of a say on pay vote. So that because we ended up on the against side, performance didn't really factor into it. One of the rationales we get when we're supporting what we perceive as a governance improvement, the rationale from companies to maintain the status quo is often things are okay. We're performing well. The board isn't entrenched. Management isn't overly compensated. So just leave things as they are, whether that's a classified board or something else. And we look at the governance structure in many ways as a preventive measure for future iterations of the board. So the fact that we don't like a classified board really isn't an indictment of the sitting board or management, but rather our desire to have the flexibility down the road if a board does become entrenched. So we've tended to discount the performance argument in those types of cases. Certainly as we think about say on pay, approving compensation going forward, company performance and the linkage to pay will certainly play a substantial role in that evaluation. And then the last thing, just real briefly, one thing, and Chris touched on this, ISS and Glass Lewis and others also provide voting platforms, which, if you want them to be, are entirely vote agnostic. And right now we use the ISS vote platform. It's a great tool for us. It enables us to centralize our voting and manage the process. That has no bearing on following the ISS recommendation. Now, if you wanted to, you can click the button and just take the ISS vote, and I think for many firms that is the outcome. It's just not the way we've chosen to approach it. Just to talk real quickly about our approach to governance as it differs from ISS, and in some ways it's similar. As I said, we end up at the same conclusion in many instances, but we've really taken a principles-based approach which gives us the flexibility to weigh in on a case-by-case basis in many issues. There are certainly issues like classified boards where I'm sure to companies it doesn't feel case-by-case, and if you look at our voting record, I'm not sure you'll find support for a classified board anywhere. But as we go down the spectrum to issues that we have a variety of views on, we'll certainly come back to those principles. And what we've done, and I realize you can't read this, just by way of an example, we've long had a set of governance principles, which I guess is the image on the left, and we're in the process of rolling out now a set of compensation principles. In the governance principles, compensation is one line item. Given the focus on compensation going into this year, we've gotten a lot of questions about how we're going to think about say on pay, so we've blown that out, and this is going to be something we start sharing with companies and boards and Dan and Alan and their clients.
It's on your website, too.
Well, the comp views is not
yet.
Yeah, so this is a black market copy right now. I know somebody. So, but the principle-based view gets us to a place where we can use algorithms as a starting point. So when we think about compensation, there's certainly a formulaic starting point. As we're looking at 4,000 companies, we've got to start somewhere. So there's a screening process, and when that algorithmic process kicks out a recommended vote against, then our senior analysts take a really deep dive into the company to make sure we understand what the basis for the formulaic result is, and then parse through the numbers. Looking at a summary compensation table, for example, not every dollar of compensation is equal. A dollar in salary or guaranteed bonus is far different than a dollar that shows up because it's a potential performance-based award that doesn't vest unless certain conditions are met. So we try to evaluate the difference between those various buckets and arrive at the right answer in the case of compensation. It also really drives the principles are the primary basis for our engagement with companies. We're spending an increasing amount of time talking both to boards and to senior management of companies about various governance issues. We're probably approaching 1,000 calls, meetings, sets of correspondence over the last couple of years, and Say on Pay has really accelerated that pace over the last several months as people want to understand how we're going to come out on the pay issue, how we're going to come out on the frequency issue. One of the things we've done both across the Vanguard U.S. mutual funds, but more broadly across our global investment platform, is centralized all the voting for all of our products with my team in Pennsylvania. The lion's share of our business is still U.S.-based mutual funds, but we do have a lineup of Australian funds as well as funds domiciled in Ireland and the UK. So all of those things are centralized with our team, including that 40% of the U.S. assets, the U.S. equity assets that are managed by third-party advisors. And then, despite that centralized process, it's really important to understand that each fund ultimately stands on its own. Each fund is its own legal entity, and as an officer of each of the funds, my duty in looking at in the funds is looking at their interests and their interests alone, really serially or sequentially. So on the vast majority of matters, that translates into consistent voting. Classified boards don't like them anywhere. So whether we hold a security in a S&P 500 index fund or an aggressive growth fund, we're going to reach the same conclusion typically on matters like that. The place where it really differs is transactional votes and contests, because in those cases, there are really two things at play. One, we've in many cases got an active investment manager that we can seek deeper insight from. Those active managers are making some sort of fundamental call on wanting to own the company and typically have really good insight into whether a contested slate is worthwhile, whether there's fundamental problems with the incumbent management. But also, we've got to take the portfolio effect into account. In each of these cases, and the third one is something that's brewing currently, in each of these cases, we've got a merger or some other transaction that involved.
You mean the fourth one?
The fourth one, sorry.
Okay. Chancellor thought that one was over.
So in each of these cases, we've held both sides of each of these deals. And in some cases, in the case of CVS Caremark, there was a third party on the outside, not a party to the deal per se, but Express Scripts also had an interest in the deal, and we held them too. So in each of those cases, we need to look at each portfolio standing on its own. So just as an example, if you look at the CVS Caremark merger from a couple of years back, CVS was acquiring Caremark. The advisory services looking at just those deals as sole holders of CVS or Caremark stock reached a variety of different conclusions based on their analyses. But the real important part for us is looking at each of the Vanguard funds. So you could basically have 3 or 4 different permutations of holdings. So in our case, we had our healthcare fund, which is an actively managed fund that only held CVS. So we were looking at the votes for this fund solely from the perspective of a CVS holder. And based on our vote, we deemed that CVS was getting a good deal on Caremark. So we voted for the deal in the healthcare fund. Now, just to make it confusing, there's another thing called the healthcare index fund, which is completely different, that oddly only held Caremark. Now, based on the fact that we voted against, you could conclude that we felt that the CVS proposal wasn't the best Caremark could do. So we voted against the deal as a Caremark shareholder just in the healthcare fund. And then just to keep it interesting, the 500 index fund held both. In this case, the index funds are going to hold things in relative market weights. In this case, CVS and Caremark were very similarly sized from a market cap standpoint, so our holding was almost exactly 50-50. You know, what the vote will tell you is the amount by which we thought the deal was underpriced by CVS for Caremark's benefit led to it being, we concluded that CVS wasn't getting a good enough deal to make the amount by which Caremark was getting shorted the overriding factor for the fund. So
Well, if you're holding both,
Yep.
why wouldn't you vote based on whether you think the deal overall creates value?
well, that's exactly it here. So we felt that, you know, without going too deep into the rationale, that the Caremark could have gotten more, and had Caremark gotten more, either from CVS or Express Scripts, that result would have been better for this fund. Maybe not for the other 2 funds, but voting for just the 500 index fund, that was the conclusion we reached.
And we could put Air Products up there too. You had some
Casey,
fun
we have a
choices.
question.
Those votes aren't disclosed yet.
Let's say you had the same situation where you held 50-50.
Yep.
But the buy side didn't have a required vote. Do you take the buy side into account when you do that, or you just look at it from the sell side?
No, we would look at the portfolio effect as well. So if,
Air Products, for example, didn't
Yeah.
have it, and they did look at it
Yeah.
theoretically from that perspective.
Well, and I think this is heartening to know that this is thought about, although I think I see some people puzzling over if they're equal market cap and you own both, why the premium is relevant. Because as I understand it, that's worrying about whether if I move my wallet from my right to my left pocket. And I think the question I always ask is don't you really have to, if you own them of equal weight, obviously if you don't have a somewhat different equal weight, it's more complex. But if they're roughly equal weight, isn't it really, what's the economic value going to be coming out of the deal, and are you destroying more value?
Sure.
Yeah,
than-
that was
Yeah.
my question. I would think if the deal is good combined, and you own them market cap weighted,
Yep.
you would always vote the same way on both of them, depending upon whether you thought the deal was a good deal combined
Right.
or not a good deal combined.
yeah, and
I would also think, Glenn, it would be interesting to then to follow up on Michael's points, does Vanguard, because I'm going to ask you some question about Vanguard's role as a initiator and whether you do anything that's initiating, but does Vanguard ever advocate, frankly, why don't you do this deal with no premium? You know, why are you worrying about a premium when the key thing out of this deal is these 2 companies ought to be together?
Right.
I mean, from an indexed investor standpoint, one would think that could often be the case, that frankly, the worrying about premiums is just some sort of, you know,
it's moving it
annoyance.
from one
and-
pocket to the other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, can I ask you a question? One of the things I know it's delicate for you to comment on, which is, But talk about the index fund for a second. This will get the thing because it follows up on what Chris said. What do your colleagues do? And at Vanguard, do you actually have a portfolio manager for index funds, or do you have a mathematician? And is that the case at other smaller funds? And is it your perception at other smaller funds where they've got a math major who's just mirroring an index, that there's anyone above them who really thinks in an index fund specific way? Because I heard Krista say he actually does have index money, quants and people like that, who basically just vote the ISS down the line. So is your perception that ISS is influential among your fellows in the institutional investor community? Is Vanguard typical, not typical?
I think among the largest firms, we're relatively typical, and you should ask Dan and Alan because they see my colleagues on the other side. So of what I know of what other large firms do, and that's my primary exposure, it's reasonably, or it's let me say it's described as reasonably similar. I don't know for sure, but as I hear, the State Streets and the Barclays and the Fidelities describe their processes, they sound very similar to mine. Whether that is in fact how they operate, I don't know firsthand.
Can I ask you an agenda-setting question to sort of finish? You have a ton of Americans' money. How many proposals do you make a year?
None.
And have you thought about making proposals? And maybe have you ever thought of making risk tempering proposals in an environment where you're often voting on what some would say would be managed to the market enhancing proposals, if you get my drift? Which is what I'm saying is that most of the proposals over the last 20 years have been to make boards much more immediately responsive to instant market pressures one way or the other. A lot of what has hit investors is, frankly, debacles arising out of people managing to the market. In the worst instances, fraud, WorldCom, Enron, but other distortions by other companies trying to follow fraudsters, or people pumping up short-term earnings because they can book those earnings and push the long-term risk. As I understand it, as an index fund, when you get rid of the firm in your portfolio is when it leaves the index, which
Correct.
means you ride it down to bupkis. What is Vanguard or other index funds, what are you doing about the political science of this, where the most short-term investors are the ones putting on the proposals, and you sit by and referee, but you don't do any agenda setting? Is there some thought or discussion about that?
Yeah, there's some thought about it. It's been a tough thing for us to evaluate. We've not taken an activist approach either from the perspective you describe, which would be kind of counter-activist, from the typical activist investor perspective. But it hasn't been a place we've gone yet. But I think certainly as we evaluate the impact we can have going forward, it's something we should think about.
Alan, and then Dan?
Well,
I don't know how you guys...
Let me just add a little bit to that, because I think by how they vote on the proposals by the corporate governance activists as opposed to the, we'll call them just regular activists, I do think they've had an effect on what success those folks have had who've been more active in terms of trying to manage the norm, for their portfolios. I mean, CalPERS money was, 80 to 90% indexed in terms of their equity portfolio. And so how they voted on CalPERS proposals over the years has done it. And, even some of what I would call corporate gadflies that practice activism from a corporate governance point of view, how they vote on those proposals also does affect it. And if you add together, the 3 or 4 other main index funds, leave Fidelity out of the ones that Glenn mentioned, how those 3 or 4 others vote on the same proposals collectively has major weight in what happens, because most companies it's 10 to 15% of their voting shares, and You don't have a lot of sway on them, notwithstanding our great wisdom that we walk into their shops. Most of this stuff is done by policy. And so while ISS may not have a lot of influence on those funds, on those policy issues, because they've made their own mind up as to what their policies should be for that 10 to 15%.
Well, Dan, I guess I would ask about that is, from your experience, do the index funds at shops other than Fidelity or Vanguard vote differently than activist funds? And for example, when there was the institutional investor push towards options compensation, which is compensation that can be kind of scary for people who are permanently stuck into the market, did you perceive any pushback or difference in attitude from things like the index funds at a shop, or is it pretty much monolithic?
I think the two biggest back then, and probably still today, are Vanguard and Barclays. And I think Vanguard and Barclays, or BlackRock as it's called today, gave managements a lot of leeway in terms of what they were voting on option plans, because they thought that ISS's model was a little too restrictive. Now, it doesn't mean they gave them a free rein, but overall, they gave them a little flexibility. And, you know, if that 5 to 8% was enough to pass, as a result, there are many technology companies that got their options plans passed that wouldn't have otherwise. Fidelity has their own model on comp and on options that some is more black and white for many companies, and makes it tougher actually to get option plans passed, where Fidelity is your 9.9% or 14.9% holder from that perspective.
Well, but at the smaller funds, and let's focus on deals for a second, do you see this kind of split voting that Glenn's pointing to, where there's a very specific consideration of a portfolio effect, right? Where Glenn's saying, here are Vanguard funds voting for a deal, here are Vanguard funds voting against a deal, because they've thought in a very portfolio-specific way about the transaction. Is that typical of smaller institutional investors, or do they basically...
I think it's pretty rare.
Pretty rare?
And I think even within Vanguard, while it may happen on the very mega deals where they own stock in both, I think it's very hard for you to really see that, no matter how they voted on air, gas, or air products, that it was because they held shares in both in different proportions that came out with the answer. That may be what had happened in Glenn's case and how he decided it, but it's surely very difficult from the outside to know that. And if you go to State Street or BlackRock, which are the next two, or Northern Trust or Mellon, you won't. I don't think you'll find it much. They will give managements a little more benefit of the doubt, maybe in BlackRock or State Street, and Mellon will give ISS more of the benefit of the doubt.
Mellon will give ISS the benefit of the doubt 99.5% of the time.
And Northern's not much better.
Yeah, I mean, we're missing the forest for the trees here, because once you get past Vanguard, which is truly the exception to the rule, and then, BlackRock and State Street have gotten better and are acting independently of ISS these days. Virtually all of the other index funds are going to be following ISS or Glass Lewis.
Well, and let me ask a very specific question. If they're following ISS in a stock merger, right, does that mean that they will have index funds both vote for and against the same deal?
Well, they won't for the same company. They might.
No, the same company.
Many will.
No, that's what I'm asking, which is, you've got an index fund, right? Just like those deals. You own both companies. Will the index funds, in your experience, because ISS takes an issuer by issuer basis. So in the HP Compaq merger, ISS makes a call, it was controversial, and they made a call on behalf of HP, I think, ultimately. Yeah. And that was controversial because that was the question. On Compaq, it was just easy. Oh, take the premium. You have an index fund, they own both HP and Compaq. And once somebody tried to defend it on the fact that, well, I said something, well, you got to think about the thing, they're equal weight. And the person said, well, no, HP is actually bigger. And I said, well, that makes it even more stupid to vote yes on Compaq and no on HP. And are there index funds now out there where they vote yes for one issuer that they own, and they vote no for the other.
If ISS so recommends. Sure.
Yeah, and ISS will do that 1 out of 50 times, so that's not very often that they even think that sophisticated.
But the point is that there's no thought going into that vote. They get a page from ISS, and unlike Glenn, who does the analysis, they fulfill their fiduciary duty.
Well, and who do you talk to at these institutional investor shops? Is it basically one unified group which then flows down whatever it does through the entire fund?
In some cases, there may be a proxy committee. In others, it's nobody, or an individual hasn't picked up his phone in 25 years.
You're talking dimensional.
No,
Well,
actually,
I mean, you know, one of the richest guys in America has a quant fund that, you know, he couldn't care less about proxy voting. And, you know, we think he votes with ISS, but we can't get somebody there to confirm it because they won't answer the phone. And so Alan and I will believe that that's what happens, and there's 4 or 5 other quant funds that are very similar. And, you know, on some companies, that could be 8 or 10% of the company. It's pretty sad.
Well, so for the two of you who actually have to go through it, how influential do you perceive ISS to be then in Glass-Lewis in terms of your ability to successfully win a high-stakes fight?
You've got 20 to 30% of the outstanding that are subscribers. 85% of those shares will get voted. When we model outcomes, and both Dan and I do this all the time, we typically assume 80 or 85% of those shares that vote are going to go the same way as the ISS recommendation, because half will do it blindly, and a significant portion of the others will be easily persuaded.
Until you get to Alethea or something like that.
Or ISS got it right.
Or ISS got it.
But I think Alan's, that's right. And unfortunately, you know, on the two sides of most merger votes, one side needs a majority of the outstanding, and in rare cases, 2/3. And in the other case, they only need a majority of what votes. So, you know, Alan and I have capability, even with an ISS recommendation against, if the rest of the stockholders with half a brain want the deal, that we can get it passed. But, you know, if you have a 2/3 vote and ISS recommends against, the deal's probably not going to get approved on those terms. And so, you know, while we're in Delaware, all of the REITs that are incorporated in Maryland have 2/3 requirements, for example, as an anti-takeover provision, which doesn't allow them to do friendly deals that they want to do. But that's, you know, their choice.
Well, can I ask you guys, because I think it would be a good way of thinking about this too. There's been another emerging kind of high-stakes voting context that's arisen, which is the running of short slates. That's not a reference to people my height. It's a reference to a slate that doesn't comprise the full board. And ISS has taken the interesting position that, you know, a little controversy within the boardroom is a great thing. Just throw in 3 people. And as I understood it, that there was a lower threshold to convince ISS to support a short slate than someone would take to the board. And they were more likely to recommend in favor of a short slate to make the stew more piquant. In that situation, right, which is sort of in between, right? Because in the M&A thing, I guess, Alan and Dan, you would agree that that's probably the easiest way to get a fund manager's attention.
Sure.
Is an actual transaction where you know, you could be merged out or get a premium. In that situation of a high-stakes proxy fight, but not for the full board, what is the behavior and how influential is ISS in that, and the fact that they use a lower threshold?
Again, the half that is slavish generally continues to be slavish. You might get more attention from a portfolio manager who's actually thinking about it, but in many cases, or majority of cases, that vote is dispositive. If you look at the last 7 years where hedge funds have nominated short slates, ISS is recommended in favor 65% of the time, and in almost 70% of those cases, you've got one or more elected. So, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, because when clients come to us and say, what do we do against this short slate, Dan and I will say, odds are you're going to get an ISS recommendation for, you may as well settle. So there are a tremendous number of settlements, you know, in favor of dissidents because of the, you know, the likelihood that that this phenomenon will continue.
Yeah, I mean, it's the case of something like Target, where portfolio managers had enough at stake, where ISS recommends for one or more people, are very rare. You know, most of the proxy fights for short slates are in companies that have, you know, $100 million to $1 billion market caps. And so if you go through most of those portfolio managers, unless it's somebody that only manages 100 or 200 million, it's a very small portion of his portfolio. And so even on those cases, for him to spend a lot of time on it, if he is number 20 or 18 on the shareholder list, it's hard. And so, and again, remember, most of corporate management focuses on what they call their top 10 or top 20 holders, except for they leave out all the indexes that are in there. So they're really only focusing on 8 people in their entire investor relations program. And so they don't know these people.
Well, is there someone to know at these other funds? I assume at Fidelity and Vanguard, at Glenn's firm, you guys can know Glenn and develop a relationship with the people at Vanguard, even on their index money.
Sure.
At the quants, the smaller and the smaller indexes, is there somebody to actually visit?
At the quant funds, there's nobody generally to know.
And how about some of the other is there somebody that you could actually visit and talk to?
You can go visit Northern Trust and talk till you're blue in the face, and they'll vote ISS. And unless you have a commercial relationship.
Yeah.
But, you know, I mean, those are the kind of. There are a lot of places there's nobody to talk to.
Well, Glenn, how about you're listening to this on the short slate thing? You know, I assume you have indexes. You have the broader indexes that have these folks. Are you more likely on those because just from a portfolio manager's perspective, they may not be as economically meaningful? Are you more likely to just say, you know, ISS seems to think it's kind of a good thing, or do you take those things as seriously as a merger vote?
No, we take them as seriously. Our general view is that the ISS policy translates into kind of a what could it hurt threshold, and that's just not sufficient for us to, you know, throw our votes behind, you know, even a couple of people.
I think, again, if you look at the indexes, and then once you get down to the small cap funds, you also have a new player called Dimensional Fund, you know, which owns 3 to 7% of almost every company. And until probably 3 months ago, they were very receptive in terms of conversations. They, for whatever reason, I think will be going forward more, almost following, you know, out of rote, even on short slate fights, ISS. Now, you know, Alan
but Dan,
and I.
even when you spoke to them, it was the same routine. You talk to them for an hour, and then they vote ISS. So it's really not much different.
But you feel like you had a hearing?
Well, yes. It makes you feel good, doesn't it?
Yeah, at least.
But I'll give you a good example. Biogen IDEC, which was in the Chris Young era. In year 1, Icon ran a short slate. Chris Young recommended against. The couple of hedge funds that were supporting Icon supported him. The ISS client supported the company. In year 2, Chris Young said, okay, you've got a rationale. The only people who changed their vote in year 2, with the exception of, well, Glenn, who killed me on that. But the only
Not
people
that you
who
remember.
changed their vote, other than Glenn, were these kind of ISS slaves, and that's what.
Well, and in year 3 they settled, right? Rather than go through year 3, they settled.
Right, exactly.
Well, why don't we bring in our neutral, our dispassionate academic observer, who's now heard. I think, Jill, your perspective on this? You've done a lot of work in this area.
Never dispassionate. Just to clarify, we've been talking about actually a bunch of different things and a bunch of different possible ISS roles today, because I think that focusing on the contested M&A area and proxy contests really is a little bit different from everything else that ISS does and from everything else that institutions vote on. It's a much smaller overall number of issues. From an investment perspective, they're tremendously important, visibly important economically in a way that you know, governance reforms may or may not be. And the analysis of the vote is really an analysis on the fundamentals of the deal or the transaction, which is why ISS brought Chris in, you know, a banker, to do this kind of analysis. It looks really different when you focus on shareholder votes that are more governance-oriented. And governance-oriented can take two forms. One is shareholder proposals on governance issues, and another is voting on uncontested director elections, in which governance issues may drive the election, either specific governance issues at that company or general policies about what the ideal board or the ideal director should look like. And the reason I distinguish is because, you know, the overall number of votes is much higher on this governance stuff. And if you're worried or unsure about the role that ISS plays, you have to think about what's going on in those cases, and are those really the cases in which you've got the cream of the crop people at ISS or the cream of the crop people at the institutional investors? And, you know, one thing that we've seen is institutions will say, well, yeah, when it's a merger, of course we look to the portfolio managers because they're evaluating a merger vote like an investment decision, and that kind of makes sense. When it's something about a staggered board or interlocking directors or something like that, we've got a centralized policy. We've got a governance committee, we've got a proxy advisory group, or with some of the public pension funds, well, gee, these are decisions that are set by our pension fund board of trustees. And who you might say is on a public pension fund board of trustees? Well, sometimes it's like retired policemen and firemen and a couple of government officials that may or may not be voting or ex officio, but it's those people that are making these governance decisions and setting voting policy. So a really different analysis with a lot of different factors that come into play. Now, that being said, in any of these areas, and we focused on uncontested director elections in our empirical work, but whatever issue you focus on, it's really hard to measure the effect or the impact of ISS. People have said today, well, ISS swings a lot of votes. But going back to what Glenn said earlier, right, what you see is a correlation. You see investors voting in accordance with or in the same way as the ISS recommendation. And that can be due to a variety of factors. One possibility is that the institutions look at the same things that ISS looks at, and they reach the same conclusions. The same things are important. You know, maybe you never even subscribe to ISS, but you're looking at the same factors. And we found in our first paper on this that it was in fact the case. The proxy advisors looked at the typical issues that academic articles identified as important with respect to corporate governance. Now, it could be the academics and the proxy advisors are both misguided. That's entirely possible. But, you know, we sort of went through the literature and we said, well, okay, in a director election, what are the kind of things people might care about? And it turned out, yes, shareholders care about those things. ISS cares about them too, right? Add to that a second factor, and that's the incredible information role that ISS plays. I mean, you're talking about, you know, a huge number, thousands, more than 10,000 publicly traded companies. When you get beyond the U.S., analyzing the issues, dealing with, you know, what exactly the shareholders are voting on becomes tremendously complicated. And, you know, you think about it, gee, it's kind of silly for each individual institution to do that analysis on its own, putting aside the question of whether they have the resources to do that, whether they have the skills to do that, or whether they've actually got anyone in the office when the phone rings, right? You know, there may not be anyone there. And it's not just the quant funds who are in that position, right? Look at, you know, smaller from an economic perspective, but look at, you know, foundations, look at small public pension funds, look at, you know, there's a whole range of institutional investors out there that, you know, they can look to ISS and that's great, but that report, that information, is the only way that, as a practical matter, that they're going to be able to do some kind of research. Now, again, that being said, there's a difference between reading a 15 to 17-page report on each of your portfolio companies and focusing on that one-word bottom-line recommendation. And as some of our earlier speakers explained, you don't even have to focus on the recommendation and say, yes, ISS recommends for, so we'll vote for. You can turn the whole thing over to ISS and have them do it for you. Now, it's true that mutual funds are required by law to develop their own voting guidelines. And so mutual funds have voting guidelines, and these are publicly available, and you can see how they have decided that they're going to vote. And voting guidelines aren't terribly helpful when you're talking about an M&A vote because they're not standardized. But voting guidelines are a big driver behind governance votes, director elections, and so forth. And lots of other institutional investors, not just mutual funds, have voting guidelines too. So it looks like, well, yeah, we're using the voting platform, but we're really voting independently because ISS is casting our votes in accordance with our instructions, not in accordance with their recommendations. On the other hand, you know who you hire, who a lot of people hire to develop their voting guidelines? That's right, it's ISS. And, do you think on general policy issues like at what age a director should retire or on how many boards a director should serve, do you think ISS's voting guidelines are going to differ from its standard policies with respect to these issues? So, yeah, you're voting in accordance with a customized voting policy, but you're voting in accordance with ISS. So measuring this is tremendously difficult, and we've tried, and we've got some results, but, they're not cast in stone, and one of the challenges in this area is there also can be a lot of individualized stuff that we can't measure in a broad-based empirical study. So you think about things like the recent issue about the HP voting recommendation, right? That's not something that our study's going to pick up, or Warren Buffett on the Coke board. We're just not capturing that when we're looking at things like director age and interlocking directorships and so forth. We did find, when we studied this, that ISS was influential and that ISS was distinctive. At the time that we looked at this, we looked at 4 proxy advisory firms, which at the time were really the major firms. As the speakers have said today, we're down to 2. If you look at the history of proxy advisory firms, it seems to drift, down to 1 or 1.5 with some consistency. There's a history in some of our articles talking about the fact that ISS has been around for the longest, but whenever somebody else popped up, somehow it was kind of like Pac-Man, and ISS would swallow them up, or they would just fade off into the distance, and we never really had a robust competition with a whole range of proxy advisors offering different perspectives. And I kind of wonder, when we get to policy recommendations, if that's something we should be concerned about. Yeah, it's great to have proxy advisors provide this information, but if you have a menu of perspectives and a range of expertise, that really gives institutional investors something to choose without making them do all of the legwork. If you have one, then the influence becomes a little bit more worrisome. So we found that ISS is the most important proxy advisory firm, that they clearly influence votes no matter how we devise the tests, and that the only other proxy advisory firm that came close during the time period we studied was Glass Lewis. They had some measurable influence, but to a much lesser degree. Our other research, our more preliminary research based on some of the anecdotal findings that we had, was to try to get a sense of, well, was there a varying impact? And our early results are that the biggest impact appears to be size, right? The big mutual funds, like the Vanguards of the world, are not as swayed by ISS. There's a correlation, but hard to say that they're sort of slavishly following ISS recommendations. When you get down to the smaller institutions, the influence appears to be, or the correlation appears to be a lot more substantial. And one thing that I worry about, and that I ask people like Alan and Dan, is, well, okay, how does this translate into the importance of the vote? If you've got 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 institutions that really act independently and do their own legwork, is that enough to protect the voting outcome? Because by big institutions, typically we mean that together they own a substantial percentage of these companies. Does it really matter if the Sisters of Mary, whatever it is, fund are following ISS slavishly if they don't account for that many votes? So, a question in terms of how troubling our results are would depend on the significance of a lot of smaller institutions going along and sort of taking advantage of the natural efficiencies. questions about all of this, or what lessons do we draw from all of this? One of the things, and I'm looking at this more from a corporate governance perspective than from a deal perspective. One of the things that I worry about is how much do people change their behavior based on the perception of what ISS is going to do or is going to think. Right? We've heard a little bit about it with respect to these short slates by hedge funds, that now virtually all hedge funds do in terms of contested elections is run short slates, because ISS has pretty much said, if you run a slate in which you're trying to get control, we're not going to go along. There's no guarantee you'll get a 4 recommendation with a short slate, but you've got a lot better chance. But you think about other areas. You think about trends, consent solicitations or special meetings or poison pills. Does ISS set the standard? Because if you're a CalPERS or if you're an activist institution that's governance-oriented, is it worth your while to introduce a shareholder proposal if you're not going to get a favorable recommendation from ISS? And does that mean that ISS, through its policies, is setting the agenda for shareholder activism? And is that something that we're concerned about? And
Jill, one thing you might want to comment on there, I mean, how does ISS itself set its policies? Because I think this is really circular, because the largest clients of ISS that do care about these governance matters are really the ones that set ISS's policy. I don't think that most of them are created here, meaning internally at ISS.
Right. Chris, do you agree?
Yeah, no, go ahead.
You mean, Dan, a small handful of
Right.
activist institutions who are ISS clients determine the policy for all the other ISS clients who don't care?
Yeah, exactly. I think, Dan just said it, squeaky wheel gets the grease, I guess. ISS a few years ago began a pretty comprehensive off-season policy development program. So every fall, they reach out to all their clients and ask for feedback. How did we do? What policies do you like? What don't you like? And they invite people to roundtables. I think Glenn has participated in some of them. And they get that feedback. And frankly, they're a for-profit company. So, if they are consistently off base with their best clients that are paying them the most money, that doesn't make any sense. So I think Dan is correct that they do take into account the input of their clients, but Alan's also correct that the most likely people to input are people that care, are true believers on some of these issues, versus the vast majority of shareholders that don't care.
Well, and traditionally they're what I would call active managers, or the Fidelities of the world really have not, taken a position like Glenn. Have you taken an outward position as to what's right from a staggered board policy perspective and told them what they should do, or would you rather keep internally on a case-by-case basis, or even your own internal policy, or are you hiring ISS to come up with some sort of independent thinking and then give us an independent perspective? And I think it's unfortunate. It's really gone circular.
well, that was the final point that I was just going to make, was that feedback effect works both ways. On the one hand, ISS, I think, tries very hard to be responsive to its customers, as it should be, right? This is sort of a market-oriented approach, and Chris talked about the surveys that ISS does and the attempt to sort of collect voter preferences as a precursor to making its voting recommendations. And again, you would see a strong correlation between recommendations and votes based on that process. On the other hand, in a number of my students from my seminar here, we've had institutional investors come in and talk about the way on an issue about which they felt strongly, they were able to influence ISS's overall policy. And, yeah, squeaky wheel. Some institutions care more about these issues than others. To a certain extent, it's responsive, I think, to Leo's concern. At least the people with skin in the game are having some say in these recommendations. On the other hand, that's not a very transparent process in terms of how ISS got there.
Can we get Ed in here with a question?
You assume they're going to vote against you and you go directly to the investors.
Even when you're representing dissidents, Tan?
Outside of deals and proxy contests, Dan is right, you don't.
It's black and white almost always. I mean, there's a little case by case, but it's very rare. You can participate in the policy process in the fall for the new things that are coming up, potentially as issuer groups or as practitioners. But you really can't do much. They did allow issuers to say, I won't do it again, and get away for, with a policy that they had and change it going forward. So you can get, or could get, an ISS change of recommendation or a variance of what they might otherwise recommend on certain discrete issues on compensation, for example. But most of their governance stuff is very black and white. Most of their withhold policies on the directors, other than, they'll allow you to say that somebody had a heart attack and therefore missed 2 out of the 75% of the board meetings, and they'll give them a pass on a director. But most of their governance actions and most of their views on shareholder proposals are black and white. And so you really have to, while we say go directly to the investors, well, and you go directly to the investors that will make a decision, and you have to win by enough of a margin that those that won't listen to you don't matter. And
okay. Sorry. I think we've set the stage for some deeper policy discussion.
If I could ask first whether Chris could respond more to Jill's hypothesis that the causality could go either way, and that you're being influenced in your decisions by what your clients, how you think your clients want to vote.
Do I think that that's a correct assessment? Absolutely.
Whether you're giving people, if you're telling people what they want to hear.
I think there's some degree of truth to that. I think it's in human nature, right? So even on specifics, I can tell you from personal experience, if you're putting out an M&A recommendation or a proxy fight recommendation, and a couple of the major fundamental long-onlys call up and say, we sort of like the dissidents here, we want to support them. ISS won't take a poll, but you're doing your own work, and you're being called by important clients that own it, again, on a fundamental basis, that aren't short-term guys, people that have followed the company for a long time. You are sort of influenced. And frankly, from my perspective, I can't speak for everyone at ISS. If I got a recommendation wrong, meaning shareholders went the other way,
you did that a couple of times.
Yeah, a couple of times. I always did a post-mortem and tried to figure out where we went wrong, if we went wrong, or why at least shareholders diverged from our recommendation, and was this a trend? To get to Leo's point before, I needed to comment on it. I mean, the framework about supporting minority slates was based on direct feedback I received from lots of fundamental investors. I always tell an anecdote, I think Alan and Dan have heard several times. When I first started at ISS, Carl Icahn ran a proxy fight at Blockbuster. We supported a couple of his candidates, but not Carl. And I got a lot of calls from fundamental investors saying, how the heck can you guys support that corporate raider, Carl Icahn? This is outrageous. He's going to be disruptive. He's going to somehow, accrue benefits to himself at the expense of other shareholders. And then a few years later, as in round 1 of Biogen, we did not support Carl. I got calls from very similar investors saying, how the heck could you not support Carl Icahn? I mean, he's...
And Chris, just so everyone understands, what is a fundamental investor? Like, name some names.
Like Fidelity's, T. Rowe Price's.
Okay. Mainstream kind of mutual fund complex, but these are the actively traded funds.
Actively traded, right.
Where a manager is invested.
Right, not the index funds, certainly.
Right, and they could be long-only hedge funds, too. They don't have to be necessarily short-term, event-driven hedge funds. There is an awful lot of money that's being driven by and managed by hedge funds that have nothing to do with all of the things we read about in the papers on a daily basis.
So to close the thought, I mean, and then as far as the additional burden we put on, when I was in that position, on dissidents that wanted to get a majority of the board, was based upon feedback I received from those fundamental investors that said, there's a huge difference in their opinion between supporting 1 or 2 shareholder watchdogs to be put on the board, and they don't buy into the disruption argument, most of them anymore. It used to work. And turning the keys to the car over to a whole new set of directors. And so that's why we adjusted the policy because of that.
Have you ever asked that they volunteer to serve on the audit committee?
No, I have not asked that.
That would be a good question to, I think, many people who actually real board people would say. But let's talk about,
Leo, real quick.
let's talk about, again, I want to get you in here, but let's talk about the framework here, the bigger picture of why ISS exists and what its role is and whether what we're doing is good for our society and investors. One of the things we haven't said, students, is the words ERISA, and we haven't talked about the words insurance. And one of the reasons why ISS emerged is because in the 1980s, folks decided to wield the federal fiduciary duty club around the vote. There used to be something called the Wall Street rule, and you voted on what you cared about, but most of the times you didn't care about the vote. And as a result, unless you cared about the vote, there was kind of an inertia in favor of the status quo. What we did was to amp up the saliency of the vote in a situation where the demand wasn't from the actual people investing in stocks, it was from regulators. Frankly, some of the people who suggested the regulation were the founders of ISS. As you create more and more votes, and this is where I want to get you in, Glenn, as we create more and more votes, folks who actually invest money have much more difficulty tracking it, and as a result, you have to find some mechanism to comply with your fiduciary duty. And if you're a quant fund and you can adopt, okay, ISS has something that looks like good voting policies, frankly, they tend to be against takeover defenses, they tend to be against other things, we'll just do that. And as a result, you have more and more votes, people can't process them, there's a default to somebody. The reason why the market, Jill, doesn't produce 10 people is no one wanted ISS. It's not like having 10 restaurants to choose from. You got to get one that's good enough to give you an ERISA insurance. And here's the thing I want to ask, and I'm going to turn back to you, Glenn, is we got a situation here where you all, I got a lot of my money with you. I'm bought into the whole idea I ought to be passive, not rack up these transaction costs, not be an active investor. And what I get from you is now I get informed voting, but no agenda setting. And we had all this debate over the years. I heard people, what were the boards doing about risk? Well, one of the things that you could surefire do under Delaware law, no question, was look at a company that ran a nuclear power company and also had a derivatives trading business. And you looked at the board structure and it had all the risk in the audit committee, 3 people on the audit committee, who were charged with all the legal and compliance risk of the company, including nuclear safety and derivatives trading. And I'm sure there's a firm out there that does both. I don't remember one proposal in the last 20 years by any institutional investor to say, the board of directors of this company is not comprised well to address issues of fundamental risk. And we are proposing a risk management committee. Or any proposals from an index fund that says, all this leverage is bothering us. We're not quite sure what stock buybacks are doing for us as a long-term investor. And these are kind of a drive-by shooting by people. They're going to threaten to run a withhold campaign unless you cut CapEx, which is great for a long-term investor, and do a stock buyback. If we have a system like this where essentially the agenda setters are a small group of funds, they're the squeakiest wheels with ISS, and they propose a system that's continually make the board more responsive to immediate impulses. Is it a good system for long-term investors? How do you protect them, Glenn? Because now on say on pay, the next thing is going to be ISS, I suppose, has got a real conflict of interest on the say on pay frequency, right? From ISS's perspective, every 4 months looks a lot better than every 4 years. But that's a kind of long, open-ended thing. But this is the dynamic we're in now, where the vote's very salient, where, frankly, the inertia in favor of the status quo, because we didn't mention students, just for the students, there's another thing called the broker non-vote, right? And it used to be that retail investors, on most it matters, the broker could cast the vote. And because the retail investor had chosen the company, they tended to vote with management. Now the SEC said, no, that's not a good thing. Let's make it really hard And as a result, the activists have gotten more clout, and the retail vote is probably, you know, been minimized. So, you know, Glenn, what are you going to do for us? Are you going to start making proposals? Are you guys going to start being more active? Is this good to have even more votes every year?
Well, I think more stuff to vote on every year isn't necessarily good. I think it's getting to the right stuff to vote on. You know, one of the things we've seen is just an incredible rise in the number of shareholder proposals on a whole bunch of issues that really delve into the minutia of things that we think in many cases are should be within the purview of the board. And you know, taking that back to agenda setting, while we haven't gone down the proposal route, a lot of the work we've done has been supplemental to the vote. So things like the principles that I put up there really drive a lot of our direct engagement with companies. So you know, the vote in many ways is only part of the story on governance. So over the last several years, this really goes back probably 2002-ish, we started a series of letters with a governance theme to them to our largest portfolio companies. So it started as 300-odd letters in the early years. We did one, I guess, last October to 900 of our portfolio companies that comprised 85% of our market value, really pushing the principles, not necessarily specific proposals, but pushing the principles out. And one of the key things that's done is really fed into the dialogue that, although it hasn't gotten to specific proposal things yet, has really opened up a lot of that discussion and has driven changes in behavior, whether that's the adoption of governance improvements without a shareholder proposal. We've had a number, there's been a lot of proposals over the last couple of years on special meetings. We haven't sponsored a single proposal, but we've had a lot of discussions with companies on that particular point, and a lot of companies that we own a significant stake in have, you know, moved in that direction. It's not the be-all, end-all. It's not the only thing we're going to do, but it's certainly a big component. So while it's not as visible as advocating or proposing shareholder proposals ourselves, I think it does get us into more of the agenda setting perspective.
Let me push more on on the point that I think Leo is getting to, which is really the balance between management discretion and shareholder primacy and the ability of shareholders to vote on more and more things, which is clearly the trend that we have seen unabated. And does Vanguard see a point on the horizon or now where shareholders are getting too much power? I would think the answer is no from what you've said so far.
No, at this point, but I do grow concerned with the growth of the number of things we vote on. The ExxonMobil proxy, I think, last year had to go to a second page.
Well, is it annoying to you because you have to vote, or is it annoying to you because you think it's not good for the company?
It's annoying to me because I think not all of the things rise to the level of critically important for shareholders to opine on.
Well, and what is, I mean, are there things that you would propose, Glenn, or that, you know, I don't, is, you know, one of the questions to ask is not stockholder power per se, but frankly, how much of an agency cost is it to people who actually, you know, invest the shares, and the end user investor whose investment horizon, you know, you're a subsidized industry. 401k is going to give you a mountain of money if you do your job well, because most ordinary Americans will have to invest for their retirement, and they can't pick particular equities, and they get stuck with a fund family selected for them. So you're going to get more and more money under management as an industry, and you're going to get to cast the vote. One of the things I'm sort of asking everybody to think about is how much is the agenda that's been set and what you end up voting on, how much does it really relate to people who want their money to be there in 10 and 20 years, as opposed to people who don't. I mean, even what is the time horizon for your actively traded fund? And I'll throw a policy proposal out on the table. Why is it that an index fund should be relying on a service that doesn't have corporate governance policies that are addressed to an index fund audience? Is that good? I mean, if we're going to have an ISS as a sort of a public utility or a public accounting, we have a public accountancy board because you essentially have to use it, right? Chris has been very candid. He came up with something that was reasonable, and it's like twice or more the holding period of a typical actively traded fund. But it's not addressed to an index fund, right? Right. I mean, should there be at least some requirement that if you're going to have ERISA insurance, that you buy insurance that fits the fund?
I think a lot of that's incumbent on the user, right? It's not ISS's responsibility to vote.
Well, and that's what I'm asking,
right?
which is you could change the fiduciary duty. If the fiduciary duty, right, if everybody who's the smaller fund is going to say the way we comply with our fiduciary duty is to get a proxy voting advisor, should you have to get one? I mean, Joe, what do you think about that? You'd have to at least get a proxy voting advisor who's addressing the objectives of your own investors.
Well, it's kind of funny, though, because the way you put the question, you're identifying a fiduciary gap at a different stage, because a lot of the money in 401ks and retirement plans isn't money that's invested in index funds. A lot of it is in actively managed funds with this one-year turnover and all of that. So then you're going to say to ISS, well, your obligation is, because you're advising 401k money, to look out for the long term, but your client, the person who's paying for your services, is this actively managed fund with a much shorter time horizon.
Oh, no, I understand. There is all kinds of layers of complexity, because one of the things I wasn't actually suggesting retirement versus non-retirement, because that is also an issue, which is should you be running 401k money in an actively traded basis when you turn your portfolio like a gerbil's wheel, because one of the things I've jokingly proposed is we should have an informed investing standard rather than an informed voting standard, right? But I was saying something a little less. If you're running an index fund, right? Put aside the actively traded thing. You're running an index fund. You're going to hold the market. Should your voting policies have to reflect the fact that you're going to hold that risk, and as a result, have to take that into account? I mean, is that something, Jill, that you've thought about? I mean, would it at least make it a richer environment in terms of recommendations?
Well, actually, ISS offers a couple of different menu options now with respect to recommendations. Okay. Again, not focused on the M&A area, but with respect to some of the governance stuff and recognizing that it has a range of clientele. So I don't see any reason why, if an index fund recommendation isn't already part of the package, there wouldn't be sufficient demand for that.
Well, I mean, Alan, what do you think? I mean, Dan, you're the ones who are saying that you have rote people who just follow this. I mean, if you're going to have that, should there be some requirements?
The real money at ISS is really not made on the voting recommendations. It's made on the processing part of the thing, and complying with not only the responsibility to vote, the responsibility to keep track of your votes, the responsibility to put forward your votes. You know, we established a new law that generated a thing called an NPX report, so that we can now analyze whether Glenn is making the decision or ISS is making the decision, and so that people had to have transparency in how they were voting. But all this did was give more money to ISS to have a new product.
Yeah, the NPX disclosure basically drove people who had made independent decisions in the past into the arms of ISS.
Yeah, I mean, so that it was a disaster, and confidentiality voting, which was the thing in the 70s and 80s, seemed to make no sense to me whatsoever, that a money manager who was not happy with something really didn't want his vote to be confidential, but we had this policy on confidentiality, and so that didn't improve corporations either. I got 20% against, but I don't know who it was. I don't think that helps either. So, we're in a quandary where there really is no way right now other than to let ADP do it or Broadridge, as they call it today, or ISS do it. I mean, there are two processing alternatives. I'm surprised that ADP didn't take up more of the role, and they try to. We really have a duplicative service out there between Broadridge and ISS.
But Leo, is your question, should there be different types of gerbil kind of?
Well, that's what I'm saying is if you're saying that an institute, one of the things that usually happens with the maturation of a player in a society is when you start exercising power, you start being subject to at least some forms of regulation in the public interest. And what I'm saying is we have amped up, one of the reasons we've gotten all the votes is we amped up regulation and required investment funds to, you know, we didn't require informed investing. We don't really look at how they all gave a market premium, as Professors Wachter and Bratton have pointed out in an interesting piece, gave a market premium to all the TARP fund recipients because they did all the short-term stuff. We don't look at that, but we do look at whether they voted.
Well,
and as a result, if we're saying that ISS is influential, should we, and I'm just throwing it out, should we know more about how ISS works? Should we require that if you're going to be able to use ERISA insurance, that it be reasonably tailored to the fund, and that you can't, for example, run a fund, a bunch of actively traded and index funds, and simply follow the ISS recommendation down the line blindly and comply with your fiduciary duties.
But the problem is qualitative. What's happening now is Glass Lewis, is the economical model because they don't engage and therefore they can do it more cheaply and offer lower rates. ISS has now been cutting to the bone. We don't have the kind of staff that was there when Chris Young was there, and the quality's down the tubes. And that's the direction things are going in. I don't know that requiring, different types of gerbil cages is going to solve that problem.
Well, and then, Joe, what's your reaction to that? Because that suggests that what you're going to have is even more votes and have them be much more influenced by whoever's making the proposals, and not that they're not necessarily aligned, but they may not always be aligned with overall investment sentiment, right?
Well, I think what Alan is saying is you have to look a lot more carefully at the business model. And I think particularly when you're focusing on index funds, you have to ask yourself, does it make sense to look to index funds to vote intelligently? I mean, what index funds are doing, they're all offering the same product. They're competing on price. They're competing on the expenses. And to the extent that you compete on expenses, you don't have a lot left over to spend, analyzing the research and developing governance policies and selecting the best proxy advisor and all of that. You want to do it in a low-cost way, and you want to get whatever cover you think you need to get. But from their perspective, how much sense does it make to get more involved? From, Glenn's perspective, to the extent he's thinking of the indexed Vanguard funds, right? Vanguard is trying to undercut Schwab and Fidelity and whoever else in their markets. And if you look at the expense ratios, they're really low. There isn't a lot left over.
But that's the fundamental, isn't that the fundamental question that we have to think about, which is if you were in the 1970s or 60s, and someone wanted to change the status quo, then the system required them to marshal support from other investors who could otherwise follow the Wall Street rule. And the index funds may not have voted. I mean, frankly, I bet I bet you John Bogle in 1974, if there was a bunch of this junk and he knew he didn't have to spend time on it, would have spent time on mergers and stuff that mattered to him, and the rest of it he would have just ignored. And as a result, it wouldn't pass, and it wouldn't happen. Now what you're talking about is the low-cost incentive, the mutual funds, which are Americans' money. That means they're going to either do nothing or perhaps amplify folks who are setting an agenda who have an investment horizon and an investment approach that is arguably contrary to, I've been at the academy. I'll point this to Michael Wachter. Michael Wachter taught me that the more you diversify, the more you deviate from passivity, when you don't take a non-diversifiable risk, the more likely you are to be an idiot.
Say that again? What are you
If
accusing
I
me of
engage
saying?
a highly active trading strategy, right, that doesn't involve me taking any real
The evidence is that actively managed funds do not outperform the market.
right, and I think
I
there's even
don't, I don't think I used the word idiot as part of my analysis.
Well, then there's the other people. If all I own is 3%, I take kind of big stakes but not really controlling stakes, and I'm very active. Again, the risk of wreckage is way high. If the agenda setters in corporate governance become the people who engage in the investing strategies that you believe depart most markedly as academics from rationality, and the people who engage in investing strategies that are the most rational are the most passive and do not set the agenda? Is that a good way to grow the nation?
That's why I was asking the question, are we beginning to get a pushback against the shareholder primacy drive that would add ever-number increasing issues that we have to vote on? And although it may be good for some business models, for those of us who were looking for low-cost investments like Vanguard, I can't imagine. Fortunately, they're big enough that it's not going to cost me too much money to have these votes on executive compensation, which probably will not go anywhere in terms of actually contesting how much managers get paid in the end. I wonder if I could ask Bob Friedman. He's looking like he doesn't want me to ask him, but Blackstone more now handles a lot of investor money, which is not just in your portfolio companies. In your portfolio companies, you get to vote all your way that you want. But when you're now investing, let's say in your India fund, and you're looking at corporate governance issues there, or in any of your American investments where you're voting, do you use ISS, and how otherwise do you make the decision? So how do you make that decision?
Probably.
Well, and I guess, Glenn, one of the things your founder once called for was a federation of long-term investors, in part to overcome the cost factor that Jill was saying. And one of the things he's saying is sometimes you get a mandate, right? And what you do is you spread the cost. Are we at a situation, has it helped? Do you perceive all the tumult is helping your long-term stuck-in investors?
No, I don't think it's all productive. I think but if you look at the behavior of even the largest investors who would presumably be the members of this federation, you don't see uniform behavior. So even those folks that are theoretically acting independently of ISS don't speak with one mind. So I think if you look at the approach and the principles that each of us ostensibly support, you're going to see a lot of similarity, but the evaluation of specific proposals and specific companies is still going to differ in practice. So I think the challenge there would be, I think you'd get a lot of agreement on principles, whether you get a lot of agreement in practice in terms of actual votes and actual voting pressure. I think there'd be challenges there.
I think one thing I think that's going to happen is compensation is really going to be the driver as to whether companies are public or private, and whether the creative leaders in entrepreneurship take the public structure or the private structure. I mean, the real benefit to all of the private money that's out there, to all of the PE firms, is that people have given up on the strategy to make wealth and create value in this structure where everything is so controlled, where there is no one way fits me versus one way fits somebody else. I mean, it's like people in Silicon Valley don't think the same rules apply to them that apply to other companies. And while the model for Fidelity might give them a little break in the first 5 years, it doesn't after that. And they have to live by the same, quote, box that ISS and other investors have put them in. And so the advantage to being public is not there. And getting good directors on boards, which, you know, get, quote unquote, lots of criticism for things that they thought they were doing correctly, does not encourage other directors to be on these boards and to be, you know, doing the right things for the companies that they're serving.
I don't know if the sky is falling the way Dan is describing, but there's certainly an incredible amount of corporate waste that's engendered by dumb ISS recommendations where companies have to go out and call their, you know, their people with 100 shares to get their votes in to overcome.
Well, I mean, one of the things is to run for dog catcher costs more money than to make an economic, put aside the social proposal, to make an economic proposal. I mean, Glenn what if Fidelity and Vanguard at least got together and said, look, frankly, as investors, we'd like to see, not that you have to pay $1 million to file a proposal, but you got to pay something meaningful. And should there be even a somewhat higher ownership threshold than, what is it, Jill? $2,000. And is there a filing fee that you even pay?
No.
No. I mean, should they at least have to pay $2,000 to file a proposal? And
I'll speak for myself, not Vanguard, but I certainly think there should be a higher threshold. You know, we see a lot of what I would consider nuisance proposals that recur year over year over year, and you know, they get enough support. You know, some of the recurring proponents have, you know, gotten smart about framing their proposals in ways that they know ISS will buy, and they get some, whatever that baseline level of support is, and they keep coming back and back and back. And a lot of the, to Alan's point, that drives a lot of corporate resource expenditure because companies know they're gonna draw an adverse recommendation from ISS. They're going to set up the calls with their top investors. So a lot of our work has, in addition to substantive engagement on issues we really care about, has been drawn into, this is the way we think about it, don't worry about that one, worry about this one. And, you know, Dan and Alan and, you know, the other folks in their business are doing a good job over time understanding where people's views are so they can advise their clients. Don't worry about Vanguard on that one, but really focus on this one. But
Should we give people a chance to
yeah, that's what I was going to say. Why don't we get the audience in here? Joel?
I'm just wondering if the folks can identify what they think is ultimately the most influential voice. If it's not ISS, if it goes step behind.
I do think you mean our friend Lucian.
Well, it's the math. I mean, ISS is always very influential. Depending upon the shareholder composition, you can say, well, if I get the 3 top index funds, maybe I can overcome ISS. You know, it varies from company to company, but ISS is a constant. It's always going to be, if not dispositive, very, very influential.
How often, Alan, though, and this gets to Joel's question and some of Jill's work, how often do you just believe that the mainstream investors are just wrong on this one, and therefore you just disagree with them, and how much is it that ISS is sort of out of step? I mean, is ISS the leader here, or are they, you know, one of the things we told our students is they're sort of a barometer for better or worse of what's going on out there of sentiment, or do they actually set the, you know, influence?
I think their clients originally set the agenda, and then they basically gave into it, and they can continue to move it along, you know, incrementally every year. But basically, their clients initially set that agenda, and it wasn't Glenn, and it wasn't State Street, and it wasn't Barclays or BlackRock, which are some of their largest clients, but it was the corporate governance community at large that set these kind of discussions. You know, again, I still come back to compensation. Compensation is the most critical thing that corporations have to deal with, and you know, it's very hard to say what the right compensation scheme is to any individual company, and they're trying to fit that into a very, you know, box that's not working very well.
Mike Barry?
Sure, it's the conflict between the corporate, right, sure. Right, from my experience, you know, we obviously heard about that conflict a lot, and I can imagine why it ticks off corporate America, because it feels like a shakedown. You got to pay on this side to get a vote on the other side. But in practice, I have to say, frankly, that the 7 years I was at ISS, I did not know the name of a single corporate client. So the system that they set up, Chinese walls, separate locations, et cetera, seemed to work, at least with respect to me, unless there were one or two occasions where a company actually said, I'm a corporate client, you know, which they weren't supposed to do. I never heard about it. So, I mean, the walls seem to work you know, from my perspective.
Do you still give out ratings? Does the ISS still give out ratings?
They give out ratings, but they changed it from a number. It used to be called CGQ, which also, you know, ticked a lot of companies off, and you could game that number. And now they put out something called GRID, Governance Risk Indicators, and they have 4 quadrants. This was rolled out sort of right when I was leaving. Shareholder rights, audit, compensation.
There's no
more number.
Is the recipe public?
Now it's actually, there's no recipe, because they'll just say high, low, high, medium, low.
Levels of
concern. No concern, and it's really just number of factors. So, you know, on shareholder rights, it would be classified board or pill not approved by shareholders. And if you got X number of factors listed, you might have a medium, and if you have one more, I don't know what the formula is.
Well, there used to be a criticism. Mike's probably heard this criticism. I just want to ask whether it still exists. That if a company paid, it could find out say, Chris, if I do X and Y, how will my rating change? And if I paid as a subscriber, I could get that information, but if I didn't, I couldn't. Is that exist or not?
I don't think it, I mean, again, even when I was there, that wasn't my side of the shop.
I think you're talking about the compensation model, which is a big moneymaker for these guys.
On the rating side.
People can use
right.
You know, I think we're going to have to close down at 6:30, and I'm wondering if we should give the panel a chance to make some last statements if they choose to.
Can we get one more question? I think Mark.
Most of the people who are asking questions are going to be at dinner, and we're going to be able to continue the discussion at dinner. Which I do suggest we keep on schedule and end at 6:30.
Okay.
So I'd go around and I'd ask the panelists for.
Okay, I guess I'll start. This is going to sound, I guess, like heresy from someone that used to work at ISS, but I agree, actually, that there are way too many proposals for shareholders to vote on. And this is my opinion, obviously not ISS's or even Credit Suisse's. They're really, frankly, to me, shareholders should vote on major corporate transactions like M&A or issuance of, you know, significant amount of stock on the board. And now that we have majority voting, that's a meaningful vote. And frankly, if you want to make change, you can withhold your vote, and that's the way you can influence everything else that you would want to influence about the company, and then maybe to amend the charter, sort of mirroring Delaware. law in large degree. I don't think people should be voting on whether Exxon should be continuing to drill for oil or not, which seems to be on the proxy every year. And that to me,
pretty consistently, right? People agree to keep drilling.
Yeah, I think so. At least the Exxon shareholders. You know, and that would give folks like Glenn, I think, the time and bandwidth to focus on what's important. And so I agree that it's sort of gotten out of control. I personally, even when I was at ISS, I was not in favor of say on pay. ISS as an organization is, I thought, again, you can withhold your vote against the compensation committee if you're really concerned about compensation. Why do you need to add yet another ballot item for people to actually pull their hair out over?
Again, I mean, my biggest concern is it's the same small group of activists that are setting policy at places like ISS that were instrumental in getting the routine vote taken away from the retail investors. Something needs to be done to balance the system because you've got, you know, influence totally disproportionate to their ownership.
So the question was posed, who is the most influential? And I think it's true. It's a combination of ISS mediating, or in some cases amplifying, the voice of some shareholder activists we haven't talked about, union pension funds. They obviously have a very focused agenda in a lot of ways, and they don't necessarily have the voting power to have their say without that kind of amplification. It's also you know, activist groups and, you know, some of the shareholder groups that together will formulate policy positions. So I think ISS is tremendously important in that regard, and I think it's tremendously important when you get down to the key issue, who should be on the board. That being said, I'm not sure we have a clear idea about the right answer. I think we've seen a lot of evolution in board composition, a lot of it for the good. So I think we have to take that into account when we evaluate, you know, do shareholders have too much power and have we been moving in the right direction?
I think just to reiterate something Chris said about, you know, what shareholders should vote on, all of our engagement with portfolio companies and our principles are really geared to those big ticket items. We invest in companies for the long term. We don't invest in them to manage them. So we don't want a say on every little thing, but we want the say on the big things, transactions, directors, the governance framework, because those are the things that will endure beyond this iteration of management or this iteration of the board, and that's really our investment time frame is, you know, we are the consummate long-term investor on the index side of the shop.
I think that, you know, the corporations of America have to engage with the institutions. They did a little bit with Congress when we got Dodd-Frank, because we almost had every corporate governance thing enacted by rote, and we didn't have to worry much about ISS at all. We would have had everything, you know, one size fits all. But, you know, we could get there on compensation, we could get there on directors, we could get there in lots of places. So the corporations have to really engage more with institutions as partners. Otherwise, you know, it's just going to all fall by the wayside on these issues, I think.
Okay. The second session of this discussion will be over dinner, and that will be at the Inn at Penn, and we should leave. For those who are going to the dinner, leave right away and go to the Inn at Penn, third floor. Please join me in thanking the panel for doing a fantastic job.